outreach and knowledge networks at UNEP. And I just want to say that we're very pleased to convene this session. This session is a third in a number of global events that we've organized around the world under the title of World at a Crossroads. It's an opportunity to brief, and it's also an opportunity to have an open dialogue with stakeholders on a variety of issues that are impacting the world today. And it is in the context of the production of the most authoritative environmental study conducted by the United Nations and by the scientific community, and it's called the World Environment Report, better known as the Global Environment Outlook, or GEO. The 6th edition is in production right now, and we are very pleased to say that we have over 80 international scientists convening at the UN here in Bangkok. And they are represented here with us today by the two co-chairs of the GEO, Professor Paul Eakins, right there, and Professor Jwaita Gupta. They are very keen to listen to you and also to answer your questions. So today we are going to look at the global state of the environment, but we're also going to look at the economic impacts in terms of costs, risks, and profits to be made. And just a few facts. For example, climate change has cost the economy in Asia Pacific an estimated over $1 billion, impacting the lives of 4.5 billion people in the last 15 years. Yet, Asia Pacific continues to be the largest contributor to global greenhouse gas emissions. So the trajectories are there, and we need to look at them and see how this can change. We're looking at the opportunities for green financing and more intelligent economic choices. Investments of around $2.5 trillion a year are required between 2013 and 2030 to transform the region into a hub for sustainability. Can this money be found and invested? Are we moving in the right direction, and are we moving fast enough? These are the questions we're asking. So very quickly, I'll just tell you about today. We have two sessions. The first session looks more or less at the natural worlds and at Earth's capacity. And the second session, we are very pleased to have with us the economists and the business sector represented through ADIC and through AXA. We are very pleased to have the CEOs, who I'll introduce to you in a second. But we are also pleased to tackle technology and innovation. We have the Asian Institute of Technology, and also we have with us a representative of young people, of youth, and how the decisions we take today impact their future. So please first allow me to introduce our first panel. We have Chief Scientist of UN Environment, Mr. Jian Liu. We have the co-chair of GEO6 for Asia Pacific, Mr. Peter King. Professor Peter King, Global Director of IUCN Biodiversity Conservation, Professor Jane Smart, and we also have GEO Co-Chair and Professor of Environment and Development in the Global South at Amsterdam University, Ms. Jwaita Gupta. So I want to start by giving the floor to the Chief Scientist to give us an overview about the capacity of the Earth to stand the speeding development globally, but also in Asia Pacific.
Thank you, Sharon. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, friends from the media, our UN Environment partners, and our colleagues from the Global Environment Outlook 6. Welcome. Actually, I was thinking what to say to use the 4 minutes a little more meaningful, because our co-chairs and key authors of the Global Environment Outlook are all here, so I don't think I will repeat what they're going to say. Hijack what they're going to say, but I would like to put this kind of discussion into the sort of global context. And you know that my first point is that Asia Pacific is the fastest growing economy in the world. True or false? This is true. I have some good figures, but do you know that by 2050, it is still going to be the case? I also have some figures. And the global GDP as of last year was like 70 trillion US dollars. And the projection to the year 2050 is going to be 220 trillion US dollars. And out of that, Asia Pacific accounts for 50% by 2050. But as it is now, it's about 40% of the global GDP. And this is not the important thing. The important thing is the growth rate, because the proportion of Asia Pacific GDP in the last 15 years has increased by 11%, and we're expecting that in the next 25 years, the share of global GDP of Asia Pacific will increase by another 10%. So half of the economy will be in this region. So that's my first point. And also, I got some figures from this PricewaterhouseCoopers, and it says that the top 5 economies by 2050, out of that top 5, 4 will be from this region. So that's the Asia Pacific. From the, I'm speaking this in front of a big group of economists. I'm not, but I quote the figure to set the stage. And also, Asia Pacific has a population, 60% of the world population as of now. And 2050 will be, the proportion will be little smaller, but still more than half of the world population. So this region, by 2050, will have half of the world economy and more than half of the world population. So that's the context we are in, right? But the question is whether the natural resources could support such a growth. Because if you think about the growth rate of this region from now to 2050, and the GDP in this region by 2050 will be 4 times of it is now, from $28 trillion to 110 trillion US dollars. So do we have the resource basis to support such a sizable economy? And you can say that, you can argue that we are always in WTO. We can do this kind of free trade, we can import resources. Okay, fine. Then what about the environmental capacity? Can you export the pollutants from this region to other regions? So I'm not going to the details of the environmental capacity because I count on our authors to speak about it. My colleague, Professor Peter King, will talk about the environmental capacity and the environmental problems in detail. So this is my question. Do we have such a big environmental capacity to contain such a big size of economy, $110 trillion by 2050? So do we have a way out of it? just give you one example in terms of only resource base, because the per capita Arab land now is about 0.24 hectares per person. By 2050, it will go down to 0.18 hectares per person. Then we're talking about, because of population increase and economy increase, we're talking about 70% of agricultural production increase and demand by 2050. And this region is worse, because by 2050, each person in this region will have only 0.14 hectares. So then it's kind of intensification process, obviously, to invest more fertilizers and pesticides and all this kind of stuff. Apparently, the two tracks will happen. One is that you will consume a lot of natural resources, and two, you will pollute the environment. So that's the situation we are in. So do we have a way out of it? It doesn't mean that we have no hope. We do have hope. And let me give you the example. In the climate change conference in Bonn in the last weeks, there was an announcement of a new research funding from climate action trackers saying that China and India will overachieve their pledges to the Paris Agreement, which is good news. And the the greenhouse gas emission in China has already passed the peak, period by 10 years earlier. And India is going to have, by 2030, 40% of its energy supply from renewables. Great news. And I also have some more figures that China invested 2015 more than $100 billion on renewable energies, accounting for 36% of the world investment on renewables. And last year, the foreign investment from China on renewables was $32 billion. And it is also projected that China will invest $360 billion by 2020 on renewables. So these are the good figures that we got from the UNEP report, UN Environment report. So we still have hope, but it's a matter of pace. How quick we can catch up, how quick we can become greener and cleaner. Thank you very much.
Do you have a projection?
Well, I don't know, but we will have with our colleagues here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chief Scientist, and I'll pass the floor to my colleague and co-moderator, Simone Targetti-Ferri, an economist, an environmental economist, and one of the producer of GEO. Please take it away, Simone.
Thank you, Shirin. Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay, right. Thank you, Shirin. Thank you, Jean-Luc. I think that's a positive message. I mean, we have hope. That's very good. That's what we need, actually. I would like to leave the floor to Peter. So Peter King is our Geo6 Asia Pacific Regional Assessment Co-Chair, and he works at the Institute for Global Environmental Strategies here in Bangkok. And Peter, I mean, we heard a bit about the region and also compare with the world. I would like you to tell us a bit more, some highlights on specific environmental topics here in the Asia Pacific, and also how it relates to sustainable development and natural resources depletions. Thank you.
Good, thank you very much, Simone, and welcome to you all. Pleased to see so many people here at the FCC. It's great. I think the headline that I'd like to see in the newspapers tomorrow that is in Asia Pacific, environmental quality is like the curate's egg. Some parts good, but mostly bad. And Asia Pacific is actually like a microcosm of the whole planet, as Jianlu has suggested, with 50% of the population and 50% of the economy. But it is very diverse in terms of big countries like China and India that have been putting economic growth and poverty reduction first and clean up the environment later. They're gradually getting around to it, but quite late in the piece. Others, like Japan and Korea, went through that stage where they had terrible pollution early on in their economic development periods, but are now much cleaner, but still struggling with economic recession and aging populations. And then we go right down to the small island developing states in the Pacific region, where they've got struggling economies constantly, and they're now under an existential threat from climate change, with potential of actually disappearing from the planet by 2100. So when we were writing the regional assessment for Asia Pacific, which is online, and I suggest that if you want numbers, that this is the document you should go to. I won't have time in 4 minutes to tell you all of the detailed information which is in here, but it is a wealth of information for the region. Just some quick highlights from that in relation to air quality. Most of you would know that we have a persistent haze problem here in the region. We have dust issues in some of our countries, and a lot of air pollutants from vehicle pollution. Overall, greenhouse gas emissions are still increasing, although gradually decoupling from economic growth. We have problems with short-lived climate pollutants, black carbon from diesel exhausts and others. We have persistent organic pollutants and heavy metals from coal-fired power stations, amongst others. The good news is that sulfur dioxides and sulfur oxides and nitrogen oxides are gradually reducing in the region. Water quality, still a massive problem with the lack of sanitation in many of the countries of the region, and emerging problems with things like pharmaceuticals and personal care products getting into the water. We need to be very careful that we don't end up having major health impacts from unexpected sources. Water scarcity is a particular problem in many of the countries of the region, predominantly from overpumping of groundwater. And this is getting to a stage where it's quite serious in some of the countries like India. There is water stress in at least 10 countries in Asia Pacific. Then in terms of waste management, we have problems with landfills, have a lot of issues related to waste to energy plants where people don't want those in their backyards. Electronic wastes is a major problem and a growing problem in the region. And then chemical and hazardous wastes, with literally thousands of chemicals coming onto the market that have never been tested on animals or humans. And we don't know what the ultimate impacts will be. And then, of course, in relation to climate change, as Jianlu has indicated, there is some good news on the horizon, but there's also bad news there. And the increase in disaster incidents with extreme storm events around the region, and changing tracks of cyclones and typhoons, causing tremendous damage in a number of countries in the region. Land degradation continues to be a major issue with deforestation under continuous increase over the last 2 decades. And then, of course, we have massive movement of people from rural areas into the cities. And cities are now becoming a focus for increased environmental degradation at a pace which is outstripping the ability of municipal governments to plan and implement appropriate measures. And then in relation to biodiversity, I'm sure Jane is going to talk much more about this, but it's under threat across the region. And this is one of the most diverse regions in the world in terms of biodiversity, and we have a duty of care to protect that. In relation to our oceans, overfishing is a major issue. Pollution from land-based sources is also increasing. Coral reefs are under threat from increasing temperatures of water and ocean acidification from climate change. In terms of technological changes, we have both promises and threats. Throughout this region, the development of artificial intelligence, robots, communication technologies, these have a dual edge to them in terms of tremendous capabilities, but also potential environmental concerns, particularly at the end of life of some of these materials. And then, of course, in terms of energy, massive changes in relation to renewable energy. Coupled with that, lots of social changes going on in the region. Here, of course, in this part of the world, there is concern about terrorism and military threats emerging. As members of the media, I'm sure you're aware of the influence now of social media and fake news and alternative facts, and trying to sort out what's true and what's not true is becoming difficult. And interestingly, this is a region which will experience aging populations more than anywhere else in the world. So Japan is looking at declining population now, and China will be probably the next country to experience aging populations with major issues. So it often feels like one step forward and 2 steps backwards, but we're making progress. We have the Sustainable Development Goals, we have the Paris Agreement, we have a range of multilateral environment agreements. Within the region, we have transboundary haze agreements and others. The key thing that I think the media has a responsibility to help us with is to ensure that there is increased public support and pressure brought to bear on some of the potential solutions to the problems that I've outlined. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter. I think it's very important that our policymakers understand these trends in order to take action, actually. And I mean, I think what you said about water scarcity and climate change and the effects of natural disaster, I mean, they're impacting quite a lot our biodiversity, not only in the region but in the world. So I also think that biodiversity could be, the tool to achieve a sustainable agenda in 2030, obviously. So I would really like Jane Smart, the director of IUCN, to provide us with some more information about it and how biodiversity could be the key for sustainable development. Thank you, Jane.
Thank you very much, Simeon, and thank you very much for the invitation here this afternoon. And good afternoon, everybody. It's good to see a full room. I'm going to start with those Sustainable Development Goals that Peter mentioned at the end of his remarks there. I guess you all know about these Sustainable Development Goals, these 17 goals for 2030. But right away, I'm going to say that we need to remember that if we're going to achieve them, we're going to have to conserve their biodiversity underpinning, if I can call it that. I guess many of you also know about the Strategic Plan for Biodiversity and its 20 Aichi targets. Those are kind of included into the Sustainable Development Goals. So there are the elements of the Aichi targets are in the Sustainable Development Goals. And this is very good news, because this means that there's a recognition that biodiversity conservation is absolutely essential to achieving sustainable development. And I should just mention, by the way, that we've got a confusion with this word biodiversity. When IUCN says the word biodiversity, we're talking about all three components: species, ecosystems, and the services they provide, and the genetic level as well. And if we wrap those three components up together, we can call it nature, and that's fine, right? And sometimes I think we need to be a little less technical when we speak about these things. Now, the bit of IUCN that I'm involved with is responsible for the IUCN Red List of Threatened Species, and I've got lots of scary numbers for you, and I could talk about these for a long time. And we've got these global figures of 41% of amphibians at risk of extinction. We've got some scary figures for the region as well, with 36% of the world's threatened mammals being found in Asia. It is absolutely terrifying. 63% of cycads are threatened globally. And I'm mentioning these different figures because what we find is that every species group we take a look at is giving us a slightly different result. And that means we have to keep going with these species assessments. The different groups are giving us different results because their vulnerability to these big environmental changes that we're hearing about today varies. Anyway, there's all sorts of reasons for that I don't have time to go into, but there's no doubt that we need to take action if we're going to address these threats. And mostly, we know how to. We just got to do a lot more of it, and we've got to scale it up. So the question at the beginning was, are we moving in the right direction fast enough and soon enough? And the answers are yes, no, and no. We're moving in the right direction, but fast enough? Certainly not. Soon enough? No. I'm going to be honest. No, we're not. But the hope spot here is, there are solutions out there. We all know of small approaches which are working, small and very, very laudable approaches that are working. I mean, think of Mangroves for the Future that the IUCN office here based in Bangkok, that granting scheme. Fantastic success in investing in the restoration of mangroves with some fantastic results in terms of bringing people out of poverty and creating new small business enterprise. This is like a sort of triple win. But we need more of this. We really need to scale these solutions up. Disaster risk reduction. I've heard about the terrible flooding here in Bangkok. Wow. If we can just shore up a few more of our ecosystems, we're going to really help to alleviate that flooding problem. And I wish we could get this message across when I hear about what those of you who live here go through when that flooding occurs. And actually, my brother lives here, and he's been telling me all about it. So we have this stark reality of the fact that there is this imperative to meet human needs. That is the way our society is working, whether it's going shopping or the food we eat. I mean, whether you're going to Tiffany's, I noticed this huge, big new shopping center, and I thought, just wow. I mean, it just blew my mind. Anyway, our human needs are clashing with our life support system. And that's the big dilemma that we face, and we absolutely have to address that, and I hope you will in this big tome that you're producing. We need new partnerships. It can't just be the conservation sector, The private sector have such fantastic solutions, And I will just take 1 minute to tell you about Toyota, who I'm working with in my Global Biodiversity of IUCN hat. We're working with the Toyota Motor Company. And wow, I'll just try and say it in 1 minute. They've set themselves a challenge by 2050 to reduce their carbon dioxide emissions in their cars to just about zero. Not just when you drive them, but in the making of the cars and in the recycling and disposal of the cars. And in addition, they're very interested in pushing for a society in harmony with nature. So this is no greenwashing. This is really amazing. And they're looking at recycling more generally. They're looking at very clever technology to recycle water. And they're looking at education and tree planting and all these different things. So that, to me, is wonderful. And they're very modest, this company, because they didn't tell the world about it until they'd really got it there, and they were really ready to put it out there. I want to finish with E.O. Wilson's law. And if you only remember one thing I say, I really hope you remember this. So at the moment, the attention is rightly on, climate change, the use of water, the shrinkage of arable land, and so on. But we also need to secure the living environment. And if we do that, we've got a chance of saving the physical environment and the living environment. If we only go for the physical environment, we won't succeed, and we'll lose them both. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, this is a very important concept, and I think the fact that we're trying to achieve human needs at any cost, it's actually going in the wrong direction against human being at the same time. So I think, and it's also important in terms of the social component of life, and that is why I would really love Joyita Gupta, Professor Joyita Gupta from Amsterdam University, and our co-chair of the Global Environment Outlook, to discuss a bit about the impact of this fast development and maybe unsustainable on our social component, gender, youth, security, and how we can handle with that in a better way. Thank you, Joyita.
Thank you. Good afternoon. So I'll pick up where Jane left off, and she was talking about meeting human needs.
Yeah.
And I think perhaps we can meet human needs, but maybe we can't always meet human greed. And this will bring me back to the storyline of what was called the right to development. So after the end of colonization, there was this notion of the right to development that was developed in the United Nations General Assembly. And this notion was not just about the right of every human being to meet its needs to live in a dignified life, but it was also a little bit about the right of groups. And those groups could be indigenous people, but they could also be communities. And some people even went so far as to say it was the right of nations to develop. And many of these nations felt that the international community made rules that were somehow against the interests of the developing countries. And if we come back to what was discussed earlier about the small island states, if they are facing an existential crisis, then have we made rules at the international level so badly that we are going to force them out of their existence? So this is where the fairness issue becomes really important. And so what happened was, in 1986, the General Assembly said, all right, we recognize this human right to development and the right of communities, possibly the right and responsibilities of states. But within 4 years, the climate change issue was on the table, and it was no longer possible for developing countries to develop quite in the same way as the developed countries had done. And so in the climate change negotiations, the right was changed. It became the right to sustainable development. And it's part of the legally binding text in that treaty. And already that right was not just a right of the poorer countries, it was also the right and responsibility of the richer countries. And my conviction today is that neither the poor countries nor the rich countries have either been able to demonstrate that they have achieved this right or that they have fulfilled this responsibility, either within themselves or in relation to other countries. So basically, what does this mean? And especially in the context of the SDGs, which says that we must leave no one behind. And the SDG document very clearly comes back and talks about human rights, but it also talks about the right to development. So basically, this means that we have to redefine development. And perhaps that means that development is not just about meeting all our greed, but it's about redefining what our need is and how we can deal with this. To take a simple example, do we all need to buy bottled water? Is that not a huge source of pollution? Could water from the tap do just as well? To go further on this line, if we are right, as Professor Liu presented earlier, if we are right that there's a diminishing amount of arable land available per person, if we are right that there is reduced water supply available per capita worldwide, And if there is a diminishing amount of sink or space in which you can emit greenhouse gases, so I mean, if you want to get to 1.5, you have to stop emitting greenhouse gases by 2045 to 2065. If you want that, that means there's less space per capita, right? Less environmental space per capita. Now, if you have less environmental space per capita, how do you govern it? So some people will come back and say, when you have shortage, govern this by pricing it. Use the market, commodify. These are very nice ways of trying to solve the shortage problem. But from an equity perspective, if you don't have the money, you can't get access to the resource. Alternatively, if you're living on top of a mine, you might even get displaced, like the indigenous people do, through land grabbing, and then the mine is then used by the people who are rich enough to afford it. So this is one way of solving problems. Pricing, markets, commodification. Another way of solving this kind of shortage problem at the national level is through hegemonic means. And that basically means that the government says, I'm not going to share. And you're seeing this come up in the area of transboundary water agreements between countries. In fact, the Water Courses Convention, the convention that deals with water flowing from one country to another country, has scarcely been ratified by upstream countries. So what you're seeing is that countries are not really willing to share because they see that there's a limit of this resource. And as you clearly pointed out, you can't become rich if you don't have access to resources. So if that is the case, we are seeing some tensions coming up. And I'm not going to come up and say I have the answer. I'm just going to say we have to openly talk about this issue. Will commodification of nature solve the problem of equity? Will hegemonization or the use of sovereignty approaches, securitization approaches, will they solve the problem of sharing water perhaps in the Mekong, the Indus, or the Brahmaputra? So you had good news for me about China and India. I'm very excited about that. But at the back of my head, I'm wondering, oh dear, what's going to happen about the Brahmaputra? And many of the rivers coming into India come from Tibet. And I don't want to point towards any problems, but I think there will be some issues regarding how do we share between these two big countries. And not only is it a complicated issue because the government of China and the government of India owe something to their own people, but how do they also think about the ownership and sharing with relation to other countries? So these are really quite big issues. And for me, it's really important to understate the point that if the Asia-Pacific region is going to develop, it can't clearly do what the West has done. It has to come up with a completely different Asian way, Chinese way, Thai way of doing business. And that new local way has to lead the way, because if you follow the northern approach, then the footprint will become enormous. So you have to find a shortcut to development. You have to get to zero greenhouse gases by 2045 if you want to get to 1.5 to avoid the worst extreme events, right? So in that case, how do you find the shortcut? And my hope is that the brilliance of your students and your leaders here in Thailand, but in China, in Southeast Asia, in India, Pakistan, that brilliance should lead the way. And we should not fall into the trap of governance approaches used in the richer countries, but rather learn from that to figure out what will serve your interests, our interests, and all the world's interests best, without compromising on the rights of women, the poor, the indigenous people, the small island states. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Wow, a lot to think about. A shortcut to development. What a wonderful idea. And what a controversial idea. Love it. Now, the floor is open. We will take 3 interventions, or 2 interventions. These are not questions, just your thoughts and ideas. And then perhaps 1 or 2 questions. Then our panel, this panel, is going to move to my side and the other side, and we are going to get the economists, the investors, the technology leaders to come and join us for the second panel. So 2 interventions from the floors. Who would like to start? No ideas, no contributions? Yes, please. So I'd need the microphone here. Would you introduce yourself?
Given what we've heard in the last few minutes,
Introduce yourself, please.
my name is Gordon Congdon. I'm with WWF Thailand. Given what we've heard in the last few minutes, I think it's unthinkable that the Thai government is proposing to build coal-fired power plants. How can we convince them to do otherwise?
Another intervention from the floor? Questions? Okay, one here, please. Introduce yourself, please.
Okay, hello everyone. I'm Pratibha Raut, and I am a master's level student from AIT. So we are aware that there have been a plethora of treaties, conventions, strategies, you know, considering like we have like Paris Agreement and all these conventions of the UN. But how do you propose that we break the linkage between like production and consumption? Because as you have yourself stated, that consumerism has reached its maximum peak. Like people are, you know, demanding products that they don't necessarily need, and you know, which is very much toxic to our environment, and which further contributes to environmental degradation, like water pollution, air pollution, you know, fast fashion brands and everything, which is primarily motivated by profit. So how do you, you know, propose to make them liable towards environmental degradation, and in policy level and government-wise?
One more from the floor? Okay, so we're good. Would our panel like to respond to the 2 points made?
So if I come back to the issue of convincing the Thai government, I think it's actually a bigger issue. We have to convince many other governments to stop fracking, take out coal. But in specific, I think if you can try to make the argument that a normal thermal power plant has a long-term investment and return, but if you have to phase out by say 2045, I'm taking the earlier date, if you have to phase out, then maybe the coal-fired plant is no longer competitive with the renewable energy options. And so maybe one should try to make a strong economic argument to try to convince these people that maybe renewable energy has a better rate of return on a longer term basis of thinking. To come to your question, I think you need carrots, sticks and labels. You need the carrots to ensure that people understand that, so you provide them with some incentives about how to consume. The sticks always have to come back in terms of where you can draw the line and where it becomes, if it's about the consumption, say, of industry or the consumption of humans, you'll use different type of sticks. So there would be, you could have a consumer consumption tax, for example, to try to limit the amount of consumption people have of certain kinds of commodities. But you could also use education and labeling. And I find that education and labeling works really well in trying to at least remove some of the extraneous things like, you know, why do you want to have a water bottle every day, you know? So some of those kinds of things you can do also through the educative process. But you need all three. And you can do that through the legal system if you want. But you can also do it through more public awareness kinds of systems.
Perhaps I could supplement my personal comments as well, because basically it's all about sort of short-term gains and long-term sustainability. If you look at the short-term gains, of course, you need the power, you need the power plant, you need it right away, you need the jobs, you need economic growth. That's the short-term ones. But in the long term, that kind of business will become outdated. Everybody else, and majority of the countries are going green, and you are still using the outdated technologies and investments. So that's a short-term one, and also the comparison of the economic, benefits as against investing in renewable energy is also a much stronger case. And don't think that China is just so generous in investing in all these kind of renewable things within its own country and overseas. They're making money as well. But it's kind of win-win situation, basically. By investing in renewable energies, and then they're also making a long-term economic benefits, profits. So that's a very strong case. Ask them to think about the China case. Sorry, I'm a Chinese national, but I'm not promoting the China case. But I'm just giving the examples. And the second question, actually, I think we are going to the right direction. The UN has a kind of 10-year program, sustainable production and consumption, and trying to, of course, there's a natural linkage. If the consumers are going for green, and the producers have to be, and that's a natural link. But on the policy, governance, and this kind of levels, of course, there should be sort of regulations, but I don't think in the democracies that people want to be forced to take one lifestyle or another. And basically, you have to do this kind of little greening, public awareness raising exercise, change mindset of people. And once again, for us as one human being, it's kind of short-term comfort or long-term kind of survival. So this is the sort of question everybody in this planet has to ask him or herself. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll thank our panel, and I'm going to ask you, this brings us to the end to the first part, so I'm going to ask Jian Liu and Juita to join me right here. We'll have to do a little bit of gymnastics, and also Peter and Jane to please take these two stools, and I'll ask our investors, business people, economists, and educationalists to please come to the chairs here.
Okay.
And bring your nameplates if you don't mind. No, it's okay, we can keep. I'll put them on top. Please. You don't want to jump there. Okay. Fair enough. Okay.
Risky.
Really? Okay.
Okay.
Thank you. Maria, please. Okay. So please allow me to introduce and welcome our second panel as we look at the economic, innovation, technology, and education aspects of sustainability. And we also, through Maria, look at what the future holds in terms of our youth and how they see the future, because our actions today impact their lives. So I want to first welcome Professor Paul Ekins. He's director of the UCL Institute for Sustainable Resources, the UK Energy Research Centre, and of course he's our GU co-chair. I want to introduce James Donovan, CEO of ADIC Innovations. It's a pioneer in data, and it helps governments and the private sector and many communities use data more efficiently, and he'll tell us a bit about that, but he's also CEO of the global, chair of the Global CEO Alliance. Martin Rueg is CEO of AXA Insurance, a pioneer in insurance globally, and they are doing really interesting exciting work, not only in managing risk, and he will tell us more about this market in relations to climate change and other natural disasters, but also in terms of their investment portfolio. I've had the pleasure to work with the leadership in Paris also, and the work that you're doing is quite pioneering in that area. I'm very happy to welcome our own Surendra Shrestha. Surendra used to be the regional director for UNEP's office in the Asia Pacific, and also director of our technology center in Japan. And right now he is the vice president of the Asia Institute of Technology. So we're very happy to have you with us. And last but not least, Maria Yezes. She's a GEO fellow from Uruguay. She's one of the authors of a new study, the World Environment Report for Youth, GEO for Youth. And we're very happy to have her to talk to us about the future outlook of what the future holds, basically. Let me start by Professor Akins, and perhaps, Paul, you will be able to share with us an insight on the economics of sustainability and climate change.
Well, thank you, Shireen. Yes, I was specifically asked to talk about the economics of the 2 degrees Paris target, and of course, well under 2 degrees is what the government's aiming for. And it's a story that fits very well after the last session, actually, and I'll pick up one of the questions that came up at the last session. And particularly as an academic, I'm interested in why Paris succeeded in getting nearly 200 nations to agree to limit their greenhouse gas emissions, whereas just 6 years before in Copenhagen, the governments could not agree anything remotely similar. There are lots of reasons for this, but the reason I want to focus on is the economic reason, which is the remarkable shift that has occurred over the last 10 years in the economic realities of mitigating climate change. At the time of Copenhagen in 2009, it was all about burden sharing, a perception that climate change mitigation was expensive and was going to be painful. And of course, developing countries quite rightly thinking that this was going to choke off their right to development, and the rich countries not wanting to pay their fair share for having occupied the atmosphere with their emissions since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. None of those sentiments have changed, but what has changed is that climate change mitigation is now a huge economic opportunity. I don't have time in 4 minutes to go into the detailed data, but if you look at the reports of the New Climate Economy report, you look at the report of the Energy Transitions Commission, and you look most recently at the report of the Business and Sustainable Development Commission, the numbers are simply mind-boggling. So the Business and Sustainable Development Commission identifies a business opportunity, and by that I mean profitable business activity, worth 1.2 trillion in clean energy, 1.3 trillion in energy efficiency, 2 trillion in electric vehicles, and 1 trillion in CE manufacturing, trillions of US dollars. Circular economy manufacturing. And you can find similar numbers in those other reports that I cited. From WWF, an answer to your question about Thailand and coal, in the most recent auctions in India, solar power has come in significantly cheaper than coal-fired power stations, even just on the energy when you don't count the clean air implications of that. So the Thai government is acting not only anti-environmentally if it builds new coal-fired power stations, it's acting anti-economically, even if you don't account for the damage that is caused to health by the air emissions from coal-fired power stations. Because I'll bet you they're not fitting the most recent air pollution equipment onto these coal-fired power stations. That means they will be very dirty. That means they will add to the air pollution in wherever the urban areas are where these coal-fired power stations are going to be sited. And they simply don't make any sense economically, environmentally, or from the point of view of human health and well-being. We've already heard from Professor Liu, China will invest 292 billion in renewables before 2020. China is not a charity. Professor Liu said it very clearly. China is looking to grow its economy through the 21st century to become an economic superpower, and it has identified that this group of technologies, circular economy technologies, clean energy technologies, are going to be the industrial technologies of the future. When Germany was leading the G7 and the G20, it commissioned from the International Resource Panel, of which I'm a member, another UNEP body, it commissioned a report on resource efficiency, of which I was the lead author. And it did that because it is using clean technology and resource efficiency technologies as the motor of German manufacturing. We found in this report that the other major economic power that is developing these technologies for economic reasons is Japan. They've had a long history of promoting the 3 R's, reduce, reuse, and recycle. And so they are addressing and have gained considerable opportunity from that. The modeling that we did with an Australian institute, CSIRO, suggested that if the world were to adopt a resource efficiency strategy, greenhouse gas emissions would come down by 25% through resource efficiency, because making and using resources also takes energy, and carbon-based energy at the moment. That global resource use would come down by 28% below what it would otherwise be in 2050. And gross world product, in other words, the aggregate of all the different countries' GNPs, would go up by 6.5% by 2030. So these are numbers which are capturing the attention of those politicians and business people who are looking to the future rather than the past. There is a perception among politicians, perhaps even the Thai politicians that you were referring to, that the environment and the economy have a trade-off relationship, and that if we want a clean environment, we have to sacrifice the economy. That can be true. There are occasions where you can see that, but for the big issues with which we're now concerned, overwhelmingly, the environment is a business opportunity, partly because we have so abused it in the past that it is having serious negative impacts on our health and therefore on our productivity and on our economy. So that's the message that I would like to give, that there is an enormous opportunity here for those business people who have the vision to grasp it. They will be the successful businesses, and the countries that take this on board, such as we can see in China, in Japan, to some extent in India, and in Germany, in Europe, these are the countries that are going to be successful. And I'm afraid that President Trump, with his perception of going back to the coal industry, is simply going back to the past. And he is going to find that his clean energy industries, the clean tech industries in the United States, firstly will fight him tooth and nail, and secondly, if Trump wins, that he will not be doing the US economy any favors. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Eakins. Moving to James Donovan, CEO of ADIC and Chair of the Global CEO Alliance, how profitable is it to be green?
Well, thank you. I'm not sure, am I having any slides, or just how profitable is it to be green? Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me. Before I answer that question, I'd say how profitable or unprofitable is it to address business disruption? For the people in this room, operating businesses or in government, you know, frankly, we live in an unprecedented time where technology, business models are being turned on its head on almost a daily basis. So I would say if we don't address the elephant in the room of what is going to happen if we don't address climate change and all of the various risks, a lot of our business models are going to be put out of business. So I actually Professor Gupta, you've taken one of my favorite lines of carrot, stick, and education. We're here at a time in history that society has to come to a different relationship with resources. At the end of the day, this is sort of a math problem. We have more people than we have resources. And we're in a data business, and I am going to get to answer your question, about 20 years. Now, some of you on the business side, I'm a serial entrepreneur. So what am I doing with all of these esteemed scientists? That's a good question. I think security made a mistake when they let me in. About 10 years ago, we saw the opportunity to sort of take our different path and use our process or capability for a purpose. Now, there was profit in it, but there was also an idea